Hi, good morning everybody. My name is Cormac Delahunty. I'm the EE coordinator at Suzhou Singapore International School in Suzhou, China. I'm from Ireland. I'm, as I said, the EE coordinator. I'm also the head of humanities and I teach DP economics. I'm joining you today to give you hopefully a useful session about the EE. Now, in today's session, we're going to talk about, first of all, the structure of the EE. We're going to talk about writing reflections, and then I'm going to hopefully give you some useful advice about how you can avoid common formatting errors in your EE. Okay, so if we talk about the structure of the EE, as you are probably aware, you must have the following 6 elements in your EE. Okay, so you must have a title page, a contents page, introduction, main body, conclusion, and the works cited. Now, depending on what referencing system you're using, you may call this a bibliography. Now, in my school, we use the MLA referencing system, so we refer to a works cited. Now, I'm going to go through each of these sections and hopefully give some useful advice. Okay, before I start talking about each section, just be aware that you don't need to include what's called an abstract. Before 2018, an abstract was a requirement to the EE. So if you're looking at older EEs, in other words, those submitted before 2018, you may see some abstracts. Some EEs that have abstracts, but this abstract is not needed, there's no marks available for it, and it's a waste of your words, so don't include an abstract. Okay, let's look at the title page. So the title page should have the title of the essay, okay, which is a short summative statement of what the essay is about, your research question, and then the subject for which the essay is registered. Now, very importantly, if you're doing an essay, for example, an English language and literature essay, you must state the category the essay is registered for. And if it's a world studies essay, you should write down the area of study and the 2 subjects used. That's very, very important. Okay, and of course you must include your word count, which must be 4,000 words or less. Now, I recommend that you explicitly label the title and the RQ, in other words, the research question. So you actually write down title and research question on your title page, so that it's very easy for the examiner to identify your title and your research question. And I'll show you an example in just a moment. Okay, before we look at the sample title page, let's look at some sample titles and research questions. So you can see, as I said, the title is just a summative statement, so a summary statement of what the essay is about, and the research question is what you're actually trying to answer, the question you're trying to answer. Okay, very importantly, do not include any of this information on your title page. So your name, your candidate number, the name of your school, the name of your supervisor, that must not be included on your title page because your EE must be completely anonymous. Okay, the examiner does not need to know, nor does he want to know, who you are or where you're from. It should be completely anonymous. Okay, let's have a look at a sample title page. Okay, so this is for a business management essay. Okay, and you can see here we've got the, sorry, make it a bit smaller. Okay, you can see we've got the title, okay, and this is what I'm talking about, explicitly labeling the title and the research question, so the examiner is not in any doubt. Okay, and also it's very important to make sure the research question, the wording of this research question is exactly the same as the wording of the research question in the introduction. Okay, and you can see then I've got the subject, business management, and the word count. No name, no school, no reference to the IB, no exam session, nothing, only the details, only the required details. Okay, now moving on to the contents page. The contents page should list all the subheadings that are included in the main body of your essay and the relevant page numbers. Now, it's very important that the sections and the page numbers are correct. So in other words, if you say that the introduction is on page 1, then the introduction must be on page 1, not page 3, not page 5. Similarly, if you say the conclusion is on page 21, well then it must actually be on page 21. If you make mistakes here, in other words, if your page numbers are not accurate, you will lose marks for criterion D, okay, presentation. Now, it's very important that your number starts on page 1. Okay, sorry, your introduction starts on page 1. Your title page should not be numbered. Your contents page should not be numbered. So your introduction should be the first page, and that should be page number 1. Now, I'll send on the link to a video. I'll send that to Dr. Amit, and he can share that with you about how to start the page numbers on page number 1. Sorry, how to start the page numbers on the 3rd page, because the first page, I guess, is the title page. Second page will be table of contents, and the third page would be the introduction, but that third page should be numbered page 1. Okay, let's move on now to the introduction. Okay, so in your introduction you should have 4 features. Okay, so some context relating to the research question. Okay, the research question itself, and that should be highlighted in bold text, and of course that should be exactly the same wording as the research question on your title page. Why the research question is worthy of investigation, and the methodological approach even, in other words, how you're going to answer the research question. So let's go through each of those in turn. Okay, so if you want to pause the video and just read through these lines here, I won't read them to you. If you just want to pause the video and read through these lines. Okay, so basically, your introduction should tell the examiner what theories are relevant to the research and what research has been done previously about this topic. Okay, now, it's very important, this is not the place to include detailed background information. If you have to include background information, perhaps have a separate section called background, but ideally you would include any background information in the main, with the analysis in the main body. Okay, other useful advice is that to remember to write in the third person. So this means avoiding using personal pronouns. So you should not be writing in the first person. In other words, you should not be saying words like "I will be trying to find out." Instead, you should be saying "this essay explores," for example, or "this essay will investigate." Okay, so again, very important not to use personal pronouns. Also, your introduction and all other sections should mainly be written in the present tense. So often students say in the introduction, say, "this essay will," or this essay will investigate, but that doesn't make sense because when the reader is reading the essay, the research has already been done. So it makes more sense to write in the present tense. Now, sometimes you may need to refer to the past tense if, for example, you're talking about primary research that has been conducted, and you can see an example of that here. Okay. So, moving on to the research question. Okay, now I recommend, or at least not just I recommend, the IB wants you to have the research question in bold text, okay, and instead of simply restating the research question, blend the research question into your introduction. So, for example, say, "this essay explores the extent to which," and then write your research question in bold. Okay, now the worthiness of the research question. So, in other words, why is this question worth answering? You need to explain in your introduction why readers should care about the answer. Why readers should care about the answer to your question. So, there's some examples here of justifications for research questions. So please pause the video and read those now. Okay. Now, here's some information that you should not mention in the introduction. So, you like the subject, that's irrelevant. Your parents are into the topic, again, irrelevant. All these are irrelevant points. Your introduction should explain why this research question is worth answering in an academic context. So, for example, maybe there's not been any research done on this topic. Maybe the research that has been done previously shows conflicting results. So it's very important that you don't mention sort of personal information like this. Then instead you explain from an academic perspective why your research is necessary. And then you've got the methodological approach, okay? In other words, how the research question is going to be answered. So here you would detail what type of research you're going to use. For example, are you going to use primary research, secondary research, or a combination of both? Now, if you'd like to include this as a separate section immediately after introduction, in other words, a methodology section, that's also okay. Okay, another useful tip here is that you should be specific. So instead of stating that you've viewed many websites, books, and journals, you should actually specify what these were. I'm not saying you have to list out every source, but give the reader a good indication of the quality of the sources that you've used. Okay, now just a note here for Language A students. Okay, if you want to pause if you're a Language A student, please pause the video now and read through this guidance. Okay, this guidance suggests that Language A students should include a concise literature review in the introduction of their EE. Okay, so if you need any more guidance about that, please talk to your supervisor. Okay, another note here specific to World Studies EE students. So, as I said, if you're a World Studies EE student, please pause the video now and read this text. Okay, and obviously ask your supervisor if you have any questions about any of the content. Okay, Now moving on to the main body. Now, for most subjects, it's appropriate to use subheadings, and I think that's very useful because rather than just having a big blocks of text with no subheadings, it's very, very useful for the reader to be able to look at subheadings to know what the purpose of each section is. Okay, it's very important to use paragraphs. Okay, now a paragraph should be appropriately structured. It should start with a topic sentence, development and evidence, and I just said here the last sentence of every paragraph should explain how the paragraph relates to the research question. Often students do not link their analysis to the research question, but that's very, very important. For each section of the EE, you should explain how this section contributes to answering the research question. In other words, why does this section matter? Okay, remember that your argument must have balance, so you must be showing multiple perspectives. So for example, advantages versus disadvantages, long-term versus short-term effects. You must have multiple perspectives in your main body. Okay, this is just a sample paragraph here. I don't think I'm going to be able to fit it all on screen, but if you want to stop the video as we go along, I hope you can reread it. Okay, now, and the color key just tells you which part. So obviously the topic sentence is here in green. Okay, very, very useful to use topic sentences. In other words, a sentence that outlines the main idea of the paragraph. That really does help the reader to understand your argument. Okay, and just a note here to say that each section of the EE must relate to other sections and contribute to answering your research question. Okay, any material that does not relate to your research question should not be included. So there's no point in having information that's not relevant. In other words, information that's not helping to answer the research question. Okay, so we've talked about the introduction, we've talked about the main body. Let's look at the conclusion. Okay, now in your conclusion you should have the answer to your research question. Now your answer may not be definitive, but you need to address the research question in the conclusion. So for example, you may say that your conclusion is not definitive, but you actually have to explicitly state that. Okay, now it's very important that your conclusion is consistent with the main body. You should not introduce any new information or any new analysis in the conclusion. Okay, so I've got some features here listed of features that you should include in the conclusion and features you should not include. So if you want to pause the video and just read through these. Okay, so again, I would recommend restating the research question in bold text as you did in the introduction, and I'd also recommend that you don't include any new information. Okay, remember that if your research question starts with "to what extent," which students often use for their EE, your conclusion must explicitly refer to extent. Okay, so for example, to a large extent, to a small extent, or the extent to which depends on, that must be referred to in your conclusion. Okay, now I have a sample conclusion here. Unfortunately, I can't fit it all on screen, but I'll just go through it slowly. If you want to, you can rewind the video to read it if you want to. Okay, now moving on to the works cited. As I said, my school uses MLA, so we have a works cited. But your school may use a different referencing system, so obviously you need to follow the rules of the referencing system. But either way, you're going to need to list your sources after your conclusion, okay, in the form of a works cited. And that will usually be in alphabetical order. Okay, so it's very important that whatever system you use, whatever referencing system you use, you must include the date of access for all references to websites. Although your referencing system, such as MLA, may not require this, the IB does. So in other words, if you're using an online citation maker, the online citation maker may not prompt you to include the date of access, but the IB does want this. Okay, remember to start your works cited or your bibliography on the new page. Make sure it's formatted appropriately. Okay, and as I said, the source should be listed in alphabetical order. Okay, so you can see here I've got a sample works cited page, and this is what I'm talking about in terms of the date of access. The date of access for all online sources. Okay, so any website I'm using, I've included the date of access, and that's very important. Okay, so moving on then to talk about the appendices. Now the first thing to say is that the appendices are not mandatory. You don't have to include one, but if you do, you should include it after the works cited page. Bear in mind that the examiner is not required to, as said here, is not required to read the information in the appendices. Therefore, if there's anything that's really essential to understanding your EE, that should be in the main body. Okay, so here's some examples of what might be included in the appendices, or in an appendices. So please pause the video and read through this list. Okay, now, as I mentioned, anything that's critical to the understanding of your essay should be in the main body, not the appendices. So therefore, there should not be any analysis, discussion, or conclusions in the appendices. Okay, also, avoid frequently referring to the appendices, because that makes it difficult for the examiner to read their essay, because they've got to constantly skip back and forth between your appendices. So again, if something's in the appendices and you're referring it to it a lot, that item should probably be in the main part of your essay, in other words, in the main body. Okay, so just a couple of closing comments on this part of the lesson. Remember to have these 6 elements in your EE. Remember to have an appropriate table of contents that's correct, accurate. Remember to have the page numbers starting on page 3. And very importantly, remember to frequently refer to your research question in the main body. Often students' analysis is not linked to the research question. You should be explicitly referring back to the words in your research question throughout your EE, explaining how each part of the essay contributes to answering the research question. Okay, now I want to talk about how to write EE reflections. Okay, as you probably know, the EE reflections are assessed under criterion E, engagement. Okay, there's 6 marks available for the reflections, and you must write 3 reflections throughout the EE process. Okay, so you write the first reflection early in the process, perhaps in the 2nd or 3rd month. Then you write the interim reflection towards the end of your first DP year, and then you write the final reflection after you've submitted the essay. Now, remember that the maximum number of words for the 3 reflections, the combined total, is 500 words. Okay, so let's talk about what are these reflections supposed to show. Well, they're supposed to prove the authenticity of your work. What does that mean? It means you can explain your decision-making, your thinking, your decision-making, and your planning during the process. Okay, so the advice I'm going to go through here is adapted from this website, ibmastery.com. So if you search via Google for IB Mastery, how to write extend essay reflections, you'll come to this page, and my advice is quite similar. Okay, so let's go through it. First of all, don't just describe what you've done. If you just say, I did this, and then I wrote this, and then this, that's just a description of what you've done. It's not showing any evidence of decision making. So instead, you should explain your thinking and your decision making. Explain that you've made decisions based on reasoning. For example, in your first reflection, you may explain why you chose the subject that you've chosen. So if you've chosen, for example, a business management essay, you may explain that you've always had an interest in business and that you plan to take business as your major in university. So therefore, it makes sense for you to write a business management essay to give you an opportunity to apply what you've learned in class. Something like that. Okay, and next, you don't want to give the impression that you've only picked the easy to get information. In other words, you don't want to just say, oh, I did this because my supervisor told me, or I searched this via Google. You want to show that you've used your initiative and that you've thought creatively about the information required to answer your question. So to give you an example, I have a student at the moment who was unable to find any relevant research on her chosen topic. So nobody seems to have done any previous research on this chosen topic. So she's looking at the effects of an indirect tax on e-cigarettes in a particular part of Korea, and there's no previous research. So what she's done is she's creatively using the findings of research done about smoking in America as a substitute, or as a proxy, as it's called, for her essay. So in other words, she's looking at the findings of the American research, and she's using those to support her arguments about the effects of this tax on e-cigarettes in Korea. Okay, so that would be an example of how she's using her creativity and her initiative to create an extended essay, and that's something she could talk about in her reflection. Okay. Next point. Don't give the impression that you've just mindlessly done what your supervisor has told you to do. Instead, show that you're using your initiative. Explain why your research interests you and what you're learning. Okay, don't forget to hide your mistakes or what you find challenging. The key part is to explain what the challenges are, and even better, what you're doing to overcome these challenges. That's how you show evidence that you're engaged in the work. Okay, point number 5, it's not necessary to write your reflection in academic style, you can write this in an using informal language. So for example, you can say, instead of I have, you can say I've, to reduce the number of words that you're using. As I said here, the student voice should be apparent. So you can write in your own style, okay, but obviously don't use any inappropriate slang words or swear words. Okay, you've only got 500 words, guys, so you've got to write concisely. So in other words, don't use 4 words when 1 word would do. Okay, so for example, don't write make sure when you can say ensure. Don't write on the other hand when you can write however. Don't say as a result when you can write consequently. I recommend that you divide your reflection into 2 or more paragraphs. Focus on one idea per paragraph. Why do this? Well, it just makes it easier to read. Okay, here's some word counts for, there are some word counts rather for your, suggested word count would be to leave 180 words for your final reflection. Okay, 180 words for your final reflection means that you have 160 words for, approximately 160 words for your first and second reflection. I think it's best to leave a lot of words for your final reflection, because at that stage you've gone through the E process and you probably have more to reflect on than you did in the first 2 reflections. Okay, also try to refer to some of the learner profile attributes and the ATL skills in your reflections. If you can do this, it's good, but you have to be able to back up what you're saying with clear examples. So don't just say, I became a risk taker during the E. Show how you've taken risks. Give examples. Okay, now I recommend that you ask your EE coordinator for some samples of assessed reflections. These are available from the IB, and these will give you an indication of what a high scoring reflection looks like. As I said earlier, it's very, very important not just to be descriptive. Don't just say, oh, I did this, and then this, and then I did this. No, instead, explain the decisions you've taken. For example, why you're researching certain sources. Explain why you've chosen the methodology that you've chosen. Explain the challenges you've faced. And explain what actions you're taking to overcome these challenges. Remember, you're trying to show that you are engaged in the E process and that you're developing knowledge and skills. That's what the IB wants you to see. But remember, everything you say, you must be able to back up with examples, because any student can say, oh, my critical thinking skills have improved. But you need to be able to back that up. You need to be able to back that up with a credible example. Okay, so the last part of the lesson is just talk about avoiding some common EE formatting errors. Okay, now you'll know that formatting is assessed under criterion D, presentation, and there's 4 marks available for formatting. So these are relatively easy marks, because if you get the format right, most of the marks you should be able to get. In criterion D, you've also got to structure your ideas appropriately to get full marks, but as said, having a correctly formatted EE will ensure that you get most of the marks. Okay, so the first point I want to talk about is plagiarism. Plagiarism in the context of academics is a big deal. It's a big crime. Okay, so you've got to make sure that first of all, you're not just copying without citing sources. Okay, because that's just blatant plagiarism, and that even when you're paraphrasing, you are including relevant in-text citations. So let me be clear. The EE should be based on sources. It's a research-based essay, so you should be using the information from sources. But it's very, very important that any sources you use, you include an appropriate in-text citation to tell the reader where you got this information from. Now, whether using MLA, Harvard, Chicago, or any other referencing system, you need to follow the rules of this system closely to make sure that you're appropriately citing all the sources in the main body of your work. Okay, if you don't make it clear to the reader where the information has come from, you're going to lose marks. Okay, so it's very, very important that you have correctly referenced all your work. All the sources of information that you've used in the essay must be cited. Okay, title page we've talked about, so I won't spend too much time on this, but it's amazing how many students mess up on the title page. Don't let that be you. Include these details. Don't include any identifying information. Okay, the contents page, again, we've talked this, but just to reiterate, the contents page, the page number should be accurate. The contents page should list all the subheadings listed the contents page should include all the subheadings that are in the main body of your essay. Okay, and it's very important to make sure that the subheadings listed match the subheadings in the essay and that all page numbers are correct. Here I have some guidance about how how to customize page numbers in Word so that your page number starts on page 3 with the introduction, and I'll send these on to Dr. Amit. Okay, moving on to your works cited. Again, we've talked about this. Now, as I said, in the referencing system that you use at your school, you may be using a bibliography, but if you're using a works cited, make sure that you start on a new page. Same for bibliography. Call it works cited, not work with a capital letter, not works cited like this. List your sources in alphabetical order. As I said earlier, make sure you include the date of access for all online sources. Okay, looking at the appendices. Okay, I think we've talked about this already. Certainly, we've talked about what should be in the appendix. But even when you're looking at the appendix, when you're listing the appendices in the table of contents, make sure that if you have more than one appendix, that you include the word appendices in your table of contents, and you list the page number that corresponds with each appendix. Okay, again, that's very important. Okay, because it just makes your essay easy to read. Okay, and lastly, spelling. Make sure you proofread your essay before you submit. Even better, have one of your peers peer read it as well, because sometimes when we're so used to looking at a document, it can be easy to miss an error. Make sure your spellings are correct, make sure your essay is grammatically correct, because if it's not, it conveys a poor impression to the examiner. If you hand up an EE with spelling mistakes and grammar mistakes, it conveys the impression to the examiner that you don't care. And if you don't care, well, the examiner's not going to care about giving you marks. If you're on the verge of getting a B or getting an A, well, you need to create a favourable impression with the examiner, and you'll create an unfavourable impression if you force the examiner to read an essay that has not been proofread. So again, make sure you check your work before you submit. Okay guys, well, thank you for watching the screencast, and I hope the information provided is helpful. I wish you the very best luck in the writing and refining and the submission of your essay and throughout the rest of your IB programme.